My brother publicly shames me for ruining the family business with my poor health. But when I secretly test our DNA, I realize he isn't a blood relative at all. He's an imposter who replaced our real brother decades ago to steal the legacy. The projector screen hummed as it lowered, clicking into place like a guillotine blade. I sat at the mahogany boardroom table, my hands resting over a flare-up of joint pain, expecting a report on shipping routes. Instead, the lights dimmed and my brother Julian's voice sliced through the room. "Efficiency isn't just about fuel and logistics," he said, clicking a remote. A chart appeared, but it wasn't about cargo. It was a calendar of my life. Bright red blocks marked every day I had been absent due to my lupus treatments. I watched in a daze as he highlighted my fragility, in front of 12 men in suits, presenting my chronic illness as a financial leak in our father's legacy. He didn't look at me with sympathy. He looked at the board with a predatory gleam, suggesting that for the good of the firm, my voting rights be suspended immediately. The air in the room grew cold, and for the first time, I saw my brother not as a sibling, but as a stranger who had been waiting for the perfect moment to erase me. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the hum of the cooling fan in the projector. Julian leaned back in his leather chair, a smirk playing on his lips that didn't reach his eyes. "We need a leader who is present, not a liability," he added, his voice smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. I looked around the table hoping to see a spark of outrage from my father's oldest allies, but they all looked at their laps. Julian had spent months grooming them, whispering in ears and planting seeds of doubt about my stamina. I felt a sudden sharp chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. I realized then that Julian wasn't just trying to take my job. He was trying to strip me of my identity within the family business. That night, as the rain drummed against the windows of my apartment, I found myself spiraling back to the summer Julian returned from Switzerland. He had been gone for 8 years, tucked away in a prestigious boarding school nestled in the Alps. The boy who left at 10 was soft-spoken, his fingers always stained with graphite from the sketches he drew in the margins of his notebooks. He used to draw the birds in our garden with such tenderness. But the 18-year-old who stepped off that plane was a different creature entirely. He was rigid, his movements precise and mechanical. He spoke with a clipped, formal accent and showed an aggressive, almost obsessive interest in the shipping industry, a subject the old Julian had found incredibly dull. I remembered a small, unsettling incident that happened only hours after his homecoming. Our old golden retriever, Barnaby, who usually greeted any family member with frantic tail wagging and joy, had backed into the corner of the foyer the moment Julian walked through the door. Barnaby growled, a low, guttural sound I had never heard from him before. Julian had just stared at the dog with a cold, detached expression, as if he were looking at a broken piece of furniture. My mother laughed it off, saying Julian must smell like the mountains or the airplane, but that moment of animal instinct had stayed with me for 25 years. It was the first time I felt a flicker of unease, a sense that the boy I had grown up with had been replaced by a polished, hollow mannequin. The tension between us reached a breaking point a few weeks after the boardroom disaster. My health took a sudden, suspicious nosedive. I felt more exhausted than usual, my joints burning with a fire that even my strongest medications couldn't douse. It happened right after Julian took over the management of the company's internal insurance policy. One afternoon he called me into his office. The room felt like a tomb. He didn't ask how I was feeling. He simply slid a voluntary resignation form across the desk. "Sign this, Sarah," he said, his voice flat. "I've arranged a private fund for your treatments. I'll ensure every bill is paid, but you have to disappear. No more meetings, no more Miller Logistics. It's time you stopped pretending you can keep up." While he spoke, his desk phone rang. He ignored it, but I saw the caller ID. It was Mrs. Gable, our childhood nanny who had practically raised us. She had been calling frequently to check on my health. "Aren't you going to answer her?" I asked, my voice trembling. "It's Mrs. Gable." Julian frowned, a brief look of genuine confusion crossing his face before he masked it. "Who?" he asked. My heart skipped. "Our nanny, Julian. She lived with us for 12 years. She used to make you those cinnamon rolls every Sunday because you hated eggs." He hesitated, his eyes darting to the phone. "All right. I'm busy, Sarah. Sign the paper." The fact that he didn't remember the woman who had wiped his nose and tucked him in for over a decade felt like a physical blow. Instead of signing, I left. I went to my late father's private study, a place Julian had been trying to get into for weeks. I had the only spare key. I needed to feel close to the man who had actually loved me. While I was aimlessly tidying the bookshelves, I knocked over a heavy, locked metal box hidden behind a row of encyclopedias. Using a letter opener, I managed to pop the aging lock. Inside were our childhood medical records, the originals my father kept for insurance purposes. I found a school physical from when Julian was 9. It listed his blood type as O negative, the universal donor, just like my father. But I remembered something from only a month ago. During a company-wide blood drive Julian had organized to boost our public image, I had seen his donor card on his desk. It clearly stated, A positive. My breath hitched. It was biologically impossible for two O-negative parents to produce an A-positive child. It was a small scientific detail, but it was a crack in the dam. I felt a surge of adrenaline that cleared my brain fog. The next day I waited until Julian left for a lunch meeting. I sneaked into his office, my heart hammering against my ribs, and found a stray hair on the collar of his spare suit jacket. I sealed it in a plastic bag along with a swab from my own cheek and sent it to a private lab under the name S. Miller, using an alias for the billing. The week that followed was a nightmare of anticipation. I watched from the sidelines as Julian began to move with terrifying speed, liquidating family assets and selling off small subsidiaries that had been in our family for generations. He was stripping the company bare, preparing to flee with the spoils. Every time I saw him in the hallway, I felt a wave of nausea. I was looking at a ghost, a man who had stolen my brother's name and used it to dismantle my life. He would offer me a tight, fake smile and I would have to force myself not to scream. Finally, the notification pinged on my laptop. I was in my kitchen, the morning sun mocking me with its brightness. I opened the digital report, my fingers shaking so hard I nearly dropped the computer. I scrolled past the technical jargon until I reached the conclusion. The words were written in bold, unforgiving black ink. Probability of kinship. 0%. 0% shared genetic markers. I leaned against the counter, the world spinning. The man in the office, the man who had publicly shamed me, the man who was currently selling my father's life's work wasn't my brother. He wasn't a Miller. He was a perfect, cold-blooded imposter who had stepped into a dead boy's shoes 25 years ago. As the reality sank in, a chilling question echoed in my mind. If this man was Julian, then what had happened to the little boy who loved to sketch? The realization that my real brother had vanished into the Swiss mountains decades ago, replaced by a monster, turned my fear into a cold, burning desire for justice. The game was no longer about the business. It was about the blood. The blue light of the laptop screen felt like it was searing into my retinas, but I couldn't look away from those 4 words, 0% shared genetics. I closed the lid with a snap, the silence of my kitchen suddenly feeling hostile. I knew I couldn't go to the police yet, not without a solid paper trail. A DNA test on a stolen hair was enough to shatter my world, but to topple an empire, I needed the history of the man sitting in my father's office. The next morning I reached out to Arthur Penhaligon, a retired investigator known for digging up secrets that were meant to stay buried in the frozen soil of the past. We met in a dimly lit diner, and as I pushed the lab results toward him, Arthur's eyes sharpened. Within 48 hours he had cracked the seal on the Swiss boarding school's digital archives. Arthur called me at midnight, his voice a low gravelly hum. "Sarah, there was an incident," he whispered. In the winter of his second year, a hiking trip went wrong in the Jura Mountains. 2 boys went missing in a storm. One was found alive but severely traumatized. The other was never recovered from the ravine. The survivor was Julian Miller. My blood ran cold as Arthur sent over the scans of the original enrollment photos. I held my phone with trembling hands, zooming into the grainy black and white image of the 10-year-old boy who had left home. He had the soft jawline of my mother and the contemplative eyes of a dreamer. Then I swiped to the graduation photo 8 years later. The bone structure was similar, yes, the same high brow and straight nose, but the eyes were different. The boy who left looked like he wanted to understand the world. The man who graduated looked like he wanted to own it. The roommate who had supposedly died in that ravine, a brilliant but destitute orphan named Elias, had been Julian's physical double. To confirm the physical reality of this switch, I drove 6 hours to a sleepy coastal village to find Mr. Henderson, our family's former gardener. Julian had fired him within hours of our parents' funeral, a move that had always struck me as unnecessarily cruel. I found him tending a small patch of hydrangeas, his back bent by age. When I mentioned Julian's name, his face darkened. "That man is no more a miller than I am a king," he spat, wiping his hands on a stained apron. He led me to a small porch and told me about a summer afternoon shortly after Julian returned from Switzerland. "Your mother had made those almond tarts he used to love. The real Julian, the little lad, was so allergic to nuts that his throat would shut if he even smelled them. We almost lost him to a peanut butter sandwich once. But that man sat there and ate 3 of those tarts, smiling and nodding while I watched from the window in pure horror. I tried to tell your father, but he told me I was getting senile and to mind the hedges." The weight of this revelation was a physical burden. If the man in the boardroom wasn't my brother, where was the boy who used to draw in the dirt with me? I began a dangerous game of cat and mouse, using my master key to enter the company's old waterfront warehouse. In the very back, behind rows of moldering invoices, I found a filing cabinet labeled "Personal, Miscellaneous." Tucked into the back of a drawer was a bundle of letters, their envelopes postmarked from a small town in France, dated 20 years ago. My heart hammered as I read the jagged, desperate handwriting. "Father, please. I am alive. They told me you were dead. The man in my bed is not me. Please come for me." They were signed JM. The letters had been intercepted and hidden. The imposter hadn't just taken the name. He had ensured the real heir was silenced in a foreign sanatorium, trapped by a lack of identity while his double lived in luxury. But I wasn't the only one watching. Julian, or whoever he was, had noticed the change in me. The subtleness was gone. I returned home one evening to find 2 men in white medical coats standing in my foyer, with Julian looming behind them, his face a mask of faux sorrow. "Sarah, your health has taken such a toll on your mind," he said, his voice dripping with poisonous concern. "These gentlemen are from the Sterling Retreat. I've signed the papers to have you admitted for arrest. Your paranoia about my identity is proof that the lupus has reached your brain." He stepped toward me, reaching for my purse, his eyes burning with a sudden violent desperation. "Give me your phone, Sarah. You're not well." I realized then that he was prepared to lobotomize me with medication just to keep his secret. I didn't argue. I threw my heavy keychain at his face, and as he ducked, I bolted through the kitchen and out the back door, disappearing into the woods behind my house. I watched from the shadows of the tree line, my chest heaving as Julian walked out onto the back patio. He wasn't the polished Joe anymore. He looked frantic. He dragged a metal trash can to the center of the lawn and began throwing folders into it, dousing them with lighter fluid. The orange flames licked the night sky as I saw the original family photos and the French letters curling into black ash. He thought he was burning the evidence, but he was only confirming his guilt. I backed away, my phone clutched in my hand, the phone he didn't realize I had a second encrypted recording app running on. I had the gardener's testimony, the DNA results, and now the video of the loving brother burning the family history in a midnight panic. Arthur met me at a safe house, a small, dingy motel on the outskirts of the county. He looked pale, holding a fresh fax from his contacts in Switzerland. "We found it, Sarah. The final piece." It was a death certificate from a small village clinic, dated 5 years ago. A John Doe had passed away from pneumonia in a state-run facility. The autopsy report was brief, but it mentioned a distinct star-shaped birthmark on the back of the left shoulder, a mark my brother had carried since birth. The imposter hadn't just replaced Julian. He had let him rot in obscurity while he systematically charmed my parents and drained their soul. The realization hit me with the force of a tidal wave. This wasn't just corporate theft. It was a slow-motion murder of an entire family's existence. The administrator at the Swiss school had been paid off with Miller funds to facilitate the swap, allowing a brilliant, sociopathic orphan to step into a life of gold while the rightful heir was buried in a pauper's grave. I looked at the flickering neon sign of the motel, my lupus-racked body aching, but my mind was clearer than it had ever been. I wasn't just a sick woman anymore. I was the last of the Millers, and I was going to burn his fake world down to the ground. The motel's neon sign flickered outside my window, casting a rhythmic blood-red glow over the death certificate Arthur had placed in my hands. My heart was no longer racing with fear. It was beating with the cold, rhythmic precision of a war drum. I didn't go back to the safe house to hide. I went back to Miller Logistics under the cover of a white flag. I sent a message to the man I now knew as Elias, the man who had stolen my brother's life, telling him that my paranoia had passed and I was ready to surrender. I told him I wanted a grand farewell, a gala at the headquarters to announce my retirement and his total ascension. He swallowed the bait whole, his arrogance blinding him to the fact that a dying fire can still burn the whole house down. The night of the gala, the headquarters was transformed into a cathedral of glass and light. The scent of expensive lilies and chilled champagne filled the air, a sickeningly sweet mask for the rot beneath the surface. I stood in the foyer, my body aching from a lupus flare-up, but I stood tall. I was wearing my father's heavy gold signet ring on my right hand. It felt like an anchor, a piece of the real Miller legacy that this imposter could never truly possess. I watched him from across the room, resplendent in a custom-tailored tuxedo, holding court with the very board members he had turned against me. He saw me and raised his glass, a smug, victorious smile stretching across his fake face. He thought he was celebrating his coronation. When it was time for the speeches, the lights dimmed and the Miller I had lived with for 25 years stepped up to the podium. The room fell silent, the press cameras flashing like miniature lightning bolts. "Tonight is about continuity," he began, his voice booming with that false, practiced authority. "My sister Sarah has fought a brave battle with her health, but she has wisely decided to step back and let me carry our father's torch into the next decade." He signaled to the technician to start his presentation, a series of slides showing his achievements. But the technician was Arthur Penhaligon in a borrowed headset. As the first slide appeared, the room didn't see a graph of shipping profits. They saw a high-resolution scan of the DNA report. The words kinship probability, 0% were 10 feet tall, glowing against the back wall. I walked onto the stage, my footsteps echoing in the stunned silence. I didn't wait for him to speak. I walked straight to the second microphone. "The man standing next to me is a brilliant businessman," I said, my voice steady and clear, reaching every corner of the hall. "But he is not Julian Miller. He is an imposter who took advantage of a tragedy in the Alps 2 decades ago. My brother Julian died in a pauper's grave in France 5 years ago, while this man sat at our dinner table." I clicked the remote in my hand and the screen shifted to the side-by-side photos. The soft-eyed boy who left for Switzerland and the cold-eyed man who returned. The collective gasp of 200 people sounded like a rushing wind. I saw Elias, I refused to call him Julian even in my mind, reach for the edge of the podium, his knuckles turning white. The smugness vanished, replaced by a sickly, gray pallor. His eyes darted toward the exits, but Arthur's team was already there. I leaned in closer to the microphone. "Biological science doesn't lie, even when humans do. You aren't O-negative. You aren't a Miller. You are a thief of the worst kind, a thief of a human life." The room erupted into chaos. Journalists scrambled to the front, their microphones thrust forward like spears. The board members, those men who had stood by and watched him humiliate me weeks ago, were now recoiling as if he were radioactive. I watched as the double doors at the back of the hall swung open, and 4 uniformed officers, led by my investigator, marched down the center aisle. The click of handcuffs was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. In that moment of pure desperation, the imposter finally snapped. The polished Ivy League accent he had maintained for years slipped, revealing a harsh, desperate snarl. "I built this," he screamed, his face contorting with rage as the officers grabbed his arms. "I saved this company while you were rotting in bed. I was more of a Miller than you ever were. I earned this life." As they dragged him away, the flashing cameras captured his final fall from grace. I stood on that stage, my father's ring catching the light, and I didn't feel the pain in my joints. I felt a profound, crystalline peace. The board members tried to approach me with stammered apologies, but I waved them off. The reckoning was far from over. In the weeks that followed, I took the seat at the head of the table, not as a placeholder but as the CEO. The process was grueling. I fired every crony Elias had hired, every person who had looked the other way while he dismantled our ethics. I proved to the world that my illness didn't make me weak. It made me resilient. A woman who can survive her own body attacking her can certainly survive a hostile takeover. But my true victory wasn't in the boardroom. It was in a quiet, mist-covered cemetery in a small Swiss village. I traveled there with Arthur to oversee the exhumation of the boy with the star-shaped birthmark. Bringing him home was the hardest thing I've ever done, but when the casket was finally lowered into our family plot next to my parents', I felt the final piece of the puzzle click into place. I placed a sketchbook and a soft graphite pencil on top of the velvet before the earth covered him. "Rest now, Julian," I whispered. "Your name is back where it belongs." A year has passed since that night. My lupus is in a state of remission that my doctors call remarkable, though I know it's simply the weight of 25 years of lies finally being lifted off my chest. Today Miller Logistics is thriving, but we do things differently now. We lead with the empathy my father intended. I am sitting in the office now, looking at the wall where Elias used to keep his cold, analytical charts. In their place is a massive oil portrait I commissioned. It's not a formal pose. It's a painting of a young boy sitting on a garden bench, sketching a bird with the sun catching the gold in his hair. I reflect on the journey that brought me here. Family isn't just the blood that pumps through your veins. It's the shared history, the quiet protection, and the refusal to let a loved one be forgotten. An imposter can steal a bank account, a house, and even a name, but they can never steal the soul of a legacy built on genuine love. I turn my chair toward the window, looking out over the shipping docks my father built. I am Sarah Miller. I am the survivor. And the empire is finally, truly home.